She walked into her bank at 2:47 p.m. with a leather briefcase and a calm that had been forged in a dozen meetings where stakes were higher than a lobby confrontation. Her badge rested in the inside pocket. An executive pass sat beside the boarding pass she had ignored that morning. The marble floor caught the chandelier's light and fractured it into neat columns. For anyone watching, it looked like a normal Tuesday. For everyone who mattered, it was the moment a presumption became public. Dr. Amara Washington moved through the flagship branch of Heritage Community Bank with the casual authority of someone who knew the building's rhythms. A nod to the security desk, a familiar smile for Mrs. Roosevelt waiting at the counter, a half-step that avoided the polished brass of the directory stand. Staff glanced up, some in recognition, some in routine neutrality. And then a teller raised a hand like a small flag. "Can I help you?" the teller asked. The question was ordinary on its face, but there was a tone beneath it that set the shoulders of the room. It was the tone of procedure translated into a presumption. The question assumed a customer in need, not the bank's own CEO. Amara answered simply, "I have a quick appointment with the regional office. She reached into her briefcase to produce a note that carried the day's agenda. The teller's eyes did not track the schedule. They tracked her skin and the way she stood. Bradley Mitchell, assistant manager on duty, moved forward with the improvisational authority of a junior officer who had practiced his script in the mirror. He asked for identification. The script was familiar: name, account number, proof of appointment. On paper, those are neutral steps. In practice, they can be a litany. Bradley's voice was courteous enough to be defensible, but clipped enough to carry the shape of doubt. "Ma'am, we need to verify," he said. "Do you have a photo ID and an appointment confirmation?" Amara laid down the paperwork. Her hands were steady. "Yes," she said. There was no defensiveness, only the unhurried competence of someone who knew how to present credentials without turning a conversation into a spectacle. She offered a business card instead of the personal ID she could have flashed. Small gesture, big meaning. The card read, "Amara Washington, Ph.D., Chief Executive Officer, Heritage Community Bank." The teller's fingers hovered over the card as if it were an unfamiliar currency. Bradley took it with the hesitance of a person who had to reconcile what he saw with what his instincts told him. There was a pause, a thin, electric thing in a room used to predictable patterns. "Do you have an appointment?" he repeated. Amara's answer was measured. "I do. I'm meeting with Robert Hayes in the regional office." This was a detail easy to confirm in seconds, but the teller keyed it in as if into a ledger of needing to know. For a moment, the line between policy and presumption blurred. A security guard watched from the doorway like a chess piece waiting for an instruction. Mrs. Roosevelt, who had banked at Heritage for 40 years, narrowed her eyes and shifted her weight as though the floor itself might tilt. The exchange in the lobby adhered to form until it didn't. Bradley, nervous and by the book, made a decision in the white space between his doubt and his authority. He radioed security. "Can you call Marcus? We need someone at the front," he said, without elaboration. The radio crackled. Marcus Thompson, head of security, appeared in moments, his presence a catalogue of uniformed calm. Bradley recited the theater of procedure. No appointment confirmation, standard verification. Marcus's face did not betray the internal calculus. He had been trained for these incidents. Conflict avoidance, de-escalation, the comfortable invisibility of making a problem go away. There was no threat in Amara's stance, but there was a refusal to accept the assumption lodged at the center of the encounter, that she did not belong there. Bradley's posture suggested he believed he was protecting customers, while Mrs. Roosevelt's look said otherwise. It is the tension between the script and the lived fact that detonates. A customer at the next counter pulled out a phone and started to film. Her app opened like a pocket-sized courtroom. Sarah Chen, a 29-year-old with a local following and an instinct for the moment, hit record and then went live. "Okay, folks, I'm live," Sarah's voice said in a soft rush. She spoke into the phone as if narrating a sunrise. "I'm at the Downtown Heritage Branch. There's a woman here, she says she's the CEO, and they just called security." Her followers dialed in incrementally. The live feed began as a handful of friends, then local neighbors, then citywide viewers. The comment thread rolled. "Are you sure? Please tell me that's a joke. She's the CEO?" The timeline acted like a metronome, each new viewer clicking the dial of public attention. Inside the lobby, the camera presence shifted the physics of the moment. People become both less and more honest when eyes are on them. Bradley, aware of the bright rectangle pointed like a witness, rehearsed his side of the story louder. "We have to follow procedure," he said. "We need to confirm identity and appointment. It's protocol." Amara watched the phone, the way Sarah held it, the glow on the woman's face. She began, quietly, to recite the facts. The appointment time, Robert Hayes's office number, the agenda listing the hours she would spend in committees and council. She offered to call Robert. She offered to log into her work tablet to show the executive calendar and her CEO access credentials. Each offer was an effort to collapse the labyrinth Bradley had erected. The teller, trained to be uniform in questioning, not to navigate the histories behind each person who crossed the threshold, replied with a new phrase. "We can't let you proceed without verification." At that moment, the live stream swelled. Sarah narrated the small injuries as she saw them. "He's asking for ID. She's handing over a card that says CEO. They still want her to step outside." The live viewer count ticked, 200, then 800, then 2,600. Comments poured in with the heat of immediate judgment. "This is ridiculous," an onlooker typed. "This is 2023? Unbelievable." Amara did not raise her voice. That restraint amplified the surrealism of the scene. Her posture, upright, unhurried, framed the incident not as a meltdown, but as a problem requiring a solution. She took out a tablet and tapped it in a way that announced she had access to systems, calendars, executive portals. Bradley stiffened. The security guard took a half step forward, not to grab, but to shepherd an unspoken resolution. "Ma'am," Bradley said, diplomacy collapsing into officialdom, "I need you to step outside while we verify." The word outside hung in the air like an edict. It asked for compliance, it made belonging conditional. For anyone else, it might have been a request. For Amara Washington, it was an expulsion at the front door of her institution. Sarah's live feed captured the moment with crisp, unforgiving clarity. On the screen, Amara set the tablet on the reception counter and opened the executive dashboard. The tablet displayed an authenticated login, an internal nameplate, an executive access screen, a calendar entry with her name bolded in the morning light. The camera focused on the CEO badge she slid across the glass, on the small brass letters of her business card. "She's the CEO," someone in the lobby said. The phrase should have concluded the scene, returning it to the ordinary. But it did not. Bradley and the teller had anchored the incident in doubt. Recognition alone was not a remedy for doubt's aftertaste. The feed climbed fast. A timestamp flashed on Sarah's live. 2:52 p.m., 5 minutes into an encounter that would not stay local for long. The viewer count hit 4,156, a number that turned an inside story into a public one. Comments ran hot. A local organizer watching from home texted friends. "This is the kind of stuff we need to be documenting." A city council aide took a screenshot. Amara reached for her badge again and let the lobby have the full, quiet weight of her identity. She did not shout, did not shriek. She arranged the facts in front of them and, in that arrangement, asked for their eyes to match theirs with reality. Bradley looked at the badge, and then at the tablet screen, and then back at the live video reflected in a customer's phone screen. The triangle of images, card, screen, live, formed a truth too stubborn to ignore. But human systems do not always respond to stubborn truths in linear fashion. Instead, they respond with institutional reflex. "Okay," the teller said, the words softer now. "We can verify." Marcus, the security chief, tapped his radio. "Hold the line," he said into the small speaker. A containment tactic more than an order. 4 minutes earlier, the branch operated in the comfortable distance of routine. Now the lobby felt like an operating theater where every movement was scrutinized and recorded. The staff reached for their procedures: check IDs, call the regional manager, file an incident report if necessary. Protocol was a neutral thing until it was not. In that neutral space, strangers became witnesses, and friends became allies. Mrs. Roosevelt stepped forward, her voice low but clear. "I've been banking here since '79, she said. "I know the CEO when I see her." Her remark was a human timestamp, an anchor of communal memory in a room being rearranged by doubt. Outside of the building, the city pulsed unaware. Inside, history repeated its small cycles: assumptions, requests for proof, the escalation that accompanies uncertainty. Sarah's thumbnail-sized lens caught every nuance: the way Bradley avoided eye contact, the way Amara offered facts like a path back to normalcy, the way Marcus's hand hovered near the radio as if the next order might be decisive. The footage spread quickly beyond Sarah's followers. A neighbor uploaded a clip to a local message board. A community organizer clipped a segment and posted it to a forum. The town's local news aggregator noticed the spike in views and pinged an assignment producer. In dozens of small ways, the incident escaped the lobby and found an audience that did not have to be told what to feel. They could feel it on their own. Still, there was a fold of complexity to the moment that was not merely about right and wrong. There were policies on the books that required verification for certain security reasons. There were frontline employees who had been trained in procedures designed to minimize risk, procedures meant to prevent fraud, to ensure that a teller did not inadvertently hand over sensitive information to someone claiming to be a high-ranking executive. These procedural impulses are banal origins of extraordinary consequences. Amara understood that. She had written policy memos in the very boardroom that supervised those procedures. She knew where policy and practice diverged, and how often a bright phrase on a printed page becomes a blunt tool when wielded without judgment. Yet she could not, in that moment, take the manager's instinct personally. She could address it. "Bradley," she said softly, "call Robert. He'll confirm my appointment." The instruction contained no accusation, only a path. Bradley reached for the phone and dialed. He spoke into the receiver with the caution of a man aware the conversation might be overheard or recorded. "Hi, Robert. There's a woman here claiming to be the CEO. She says she has an appointment." Robert Hayes, district manager, was on the line within minutes. He appeared on site after a call, not striding, but moving with the measured concern of someone who would later be asked what he knew and when he knew it. He talked to Bradley, to Marcus, to the teller. He spoke into the visible tension in the room, as if performing an initial triage. "What's the tone?" Robert asked. His presence reset the power dynamics in a quiet way. The assistant manager's energy folded into the regional manager's authority. It was a demonstration of hierarchy doing what hierarchy does, absorbing a local problem into a regional response. At 3:14 p.m., Sarah closed her live briefly to take a breath. She had a following of thousands now. The clip had been shared on multiple platforms and her inbox filled with messages. "Are you okay? Do you need help? This looks unlawful." The live feed had become a civic instrument in miniature, a small public square where people could argue, console, and demand. Outside of the lobby, Heritage's communications machine was not yet fully awake. No formal statement had been issued. A branch manager might call the PR desk, and the PR desk might reach for the prepared language that serves as a default. "We take all customer concerns seriously." That phrase is useful because it is broad and protective. It buys time. Time is a currency in these moments, and everyone wants to spend it differently. Amara left the lobby at Bradley's insistence, not shoved but shepherded into an adjacent meeting room as if that would resolve the matter. She carried with her the tablet that proved what she said. She set it face up on a conference table and tapped the executive calendar. The screen lit with her commitments for the day. Town hall at noon, loan committee at 2, strategy review at 4. She inhaled and found herself thinking of how many times she had written memos about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how many of those memos had become part of a binder that collected dust rather than action. They filed incident reports, as the script required. Bradley typed into a form with a slow, tender sense of documentation. Time, parties involved, description. He wrote what he saw, which was both truthful and inadequate. Marcus added his note: security check, request for verification, escort to meeting room. The teller did what the teller did, logged the client interaction and waited. Mrs. Roosevelt stayed at the counter, a witness who would not let the moment be tidied. Back on her phone, Sarah took a breath and posted a short clip to her bio saying, "If you're seeing this for the first time, keep watching. This is only the beginning." The words were simple and direct. They were a soft CTA lobbed at a live and growing audience. People responded with urgency. Following, sharing, where's the CEO? Tens of thousands of tiny reactions pooled into a larger pressure. The social media pressure made the event escalate in ways the bank's internal procedures could not anticipate. That same evening, the institutional signal began to shift. The call that had been a local exchange became a call to headquarters. Ellen Rodriguez, the chief of staff, saw the clip on a colleague's phone in a meeting and was the kind of leader who understood the danger of delay. She called Maria Santos, general counsel, James Wright, compliance director, and Marcus got a different set of instructions. Stand down, but don't disturb the scene. "We will handle it," Ellen said, after absorbing a 5-minute compilation of Sarah's live, the teller's uncertainty, and the way Amara had been guided to a side room. Hours passed between the live feed's viral spike and the arrival of an executive team that could change the story. That lag mattered. In those hours, dozens of copies of the clip traveled to inboxes, group chats, and the feeds of local politicians. The clip entered the city's conversation as if it had always been part of it, the way a small policy decision becomes a public test. For a bank, reputation is both an asset and an obligation. For Amara Washington, reputation had become a test of whether her institution would treat righting wrongs as a procedural checkbox or as the housework of institutional learning. At 7:03 p.m., Ellen Rodriguez walked back into the flagship branch accompanied by Maria Santos and James Wright. The evening light slanted through the high windows and softened the marble. Ellen moved with a deliberateness that stripped the lobby of both theatricality and panic. She addressed the room with a measured tone. Stand down from public comments. Gather the footage. Secure the social media captures. Prepare to compile a timeline. Marcus, who had been there since early afternoon, acknowledged the order with military precision. Hours later, those same hours that in the public felt like an eternity, but in corporate planning felt like a window, the legal and corporate teams arrived fully assembled. Their arrival had the quality of a controlled incursion. They did not rush the lobby. They orchestrated an entrance. Maria had a laptop in her hand. James brought a compliance binder. Ellen carried a tablet with a blank page ready to parse the public narrative. They set up in a small conference room just off the lobby and began the work that would define the rest of the story: sorting footage, timestamps, witness statements. The moment they convened, the tone of the incident shifted from frontline embarrassment to corporate crisis management. The old binaries of right and wrong were not replaced. They were sharpened into legal exposure, reputational risk, and operational failure. Amara watched them arrange the scene. She felt neither triumph nor vindication in their arrival, only a fierce, quiet desire for the work to be done honestly. Ellen began with the obvious, a list of sources. Sarah's live clip, verified and timestamped at 2:52 p.m. The branch CCTV footage with continuous recording of the lobby. The incident reports completed by Bradley, Marcus, and the teller. Witness statements from Mrs. Roosevelt and 2 other customers. Screenshots of posts and shares. The chain of custody for each file mattered. If the bank intended to respond credibly, every capture had to be authenticated. Maria, in her role as general counsel, laid out the potential legal landscape with the careful language of someone who knows the difference between possibility and certainty. She invoked the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, ECO, which prohibits discrimination in lending, and the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, which encourages banks to meet the credit needs of their communities. Both parameters, she suggested, within which regulators might view the incident. Maria did not make predictions. She labeled risks. "We are exposed to reputational harm," she said. "There is potential regulatory scrutiny. We must assume inquiries." Her phrasing was precise. Potential liability, not guaranteed outcome. James, the compliance director, translated the legal vulnerabilities into operational failures. "Frontline training failed," he said. "We don't have a proper escalation matrix that accounts for executive verification in real time. We don't have a bias audit trigger for interactions that escalate to security. That's a policy gap." He underlined operational gaps with an engineer's tempering. List the step, document the tool, fix the loop. Ellen's role was both political and practical. As chief of staff, she mapped the flows of accountability and decided how Heritage would present itself to the public. "No cover-up," she said, "not as a slogan, but a procedural imperative. We will be transparent about what happened. We will make a list of immediate actions and timelines." She paused, aware that words like transparent could be interpreted as either honesty or a choreography of damage control. The difference, she knew, lay in execution. Amara watched as her executive team worked with the economy of focus she had trained others to have in a crisis. They compiled the timeline. 2:47 p.m., Amara enters the lobby. 2:50 p.m., teller requests ID. 2:52 p.m., Sarah goes live. 3:14 p.m., Robert Hayes confirms appointment. 7:03 p.m., executive team arrives. The timeline was a skeleton they would flesh with actions, statements, and decisions. There was room in the conference room for a certain kind of honesty, and Maria invited it. "We must assume this will be public for a while," she said. "We must prepare to offer immediate remedies and long-term commitments." She suggested a measured initial statement acknowledging the incident, promising an internal review, and noting that Amara herself would lead an equity-focused task force, language that would be both a real action and a signal. The team began to draft a statement while they gathered evidence. They reached out to their legal counsel outside the bank for advice on obligatory disclosures and the need to preserve documents. They instructed Marcus to secure the lobby footage and to preserve the chain of custody for every phone and device involved. They asked Bradley to prepare an account of his actions that included the reasons he followed procedure. They asked the teller to write a witness statement. Every piece of paper, every saved screenshot was a potential exhibit if regulatory inquiry or litigation followed. Outside the narrow frame of legal risk, the bank's leaders faced the social dimensions of the incident. Sarah's followers, now in the tens of thousands, had shared the clip with headlines that demanded more than an apology. Community organizers voiced the expectation that the bank would not only discipline individuals, but also take systemic steps: bias training, external audits, public reporting, reallocation of community investments. For a community that had felt historically underserved, this was not only about making the CEO whole. It was about whether Heritage would translate embarrassment into transformation. Back in the lobby, Bradley sat at his desk. The evening light made his fingers tremble as he hovered over a drafted statement. He had been summoned to the conference room and asked to explain his decisions. His words, written later that night, read like the interplay of training and fear. "I followed procedures for verifying a VIP. I asked for ID and confirmation. I called security when I felt uncertain."
He did not write about the moment he had feared being wrong, or about how the live feed had suddenly made him the subject of scrutiny rather than the owner of procedure. The first hours after the incident were a crucible where roles crystallized. Amara as the composed center, Ellen as the organizer, Maria as the analyst of exposure, James as the critic of systems, Marcus as the keeper of security, Bradley as the agent of the front line, Sarah as the public witness, and Mrs. Roosevelt as the community memory. Each had a stake in how the story would be told and, more importantly, in whether the bank would do the kind of work that made change real rather than performative. Ellen sent a short internal note that evening. "We will convene a special board committee tomorrow. We will propose immediate personnel actions, short-term policy updates, and a public-facing plan for training and community engagement." She included the phrase corrective measures and equity audit, not as mere rhetoric, but as signals of what the team thought might satisfy both regulators and community expectations. Amara sat in the quiet of the conference room and watched the team run through possibilities. She listened to legal counsel explain the difference between a regulatory inquiry and a formal complaint. She watched compliance sketch an action plan that included immediate retraining and a review of the branch's escalation policies. When Marcus returned from the lobby, he had a small stack of printed screenshots and transcriptions of Sarah's live comments.
The documents were physical proofs of what the cameras had captured, another kind of ledger. At one point, Maria looked up and said, as gently as law allows, "We can't promise outcomes, but we can promise process and transparency." The phrasing was cautious because guarantees are brittle, they can break under judicial scrutiny. The team knew that their pledges would be judged by both regulators and the public on follow-through rather than flourish. Amara made one request that evening, less a directive than a test of the bank's seriousness. "I want a public timeline," she said. "No evasions, no hedging. We will publish what we know, when we know it, and what we'll do next." The ask was simple and bold. It would cost them in the short term. An admission of failure is never cheap. But it would create a framework in which trust could begin to be rebuilt. The room accepted the request with a collective, almost relieved nod. They had wanted a direction that was firm and simple, and her ask supplied it. Someone had to speak for the institutional responsibility. It could be Amara, because she had both the authority and the moral claim. Or it could be the board. Either way, the bank needed to be moved from denial into accountability. In the early hours after the legal team's arrival, emails and calls multiplied. Ellen drafted a short statement. Maria prepared a memo outlining potential regulatory touchpoints, including ECOA and CRA, and flagged certain unknowns as indefinito, areas where the team lacked information to make definitive claims. James prepared a sequence of immediate operational actions: suspend involved staff pending investigation, require retraining, and engage an independent auditor. Marcus secured a list of witnesses and their contact information. Amara, meanwhile, found herself at a strange intersection. She had the power to direct change, but was also the subject of the incident. That duality reframed the moment from personal affront to institutional responsibility. She composed a short message to the staff that was equal parts acknowledgement and assignment. This was not merely a problem to be solved for her, it was a problem to be solved for the bank. As dawn approached, the narrative that had been filmed in a 5-minute lobby exchange had expanded into a corporate project. Coverage would arrive in cycles over the next hours. Social media reposts, local news summaries, headhunters asking whether the incident would impact executive transitions. The bank's public face would be watched for signs of sincerity. Amara left the branch minutes before dawn. She walked out beneath the same chandelier that had lit the marble hours earlier, and the building looked different, less like a neutral monument to finance and more like a public space that belonged to a community it sometimes failed to see. She carried with her a folder that contained the early notes from the legal team, timelines, lists, and a truncated set of possible actions. She thought of Mrs. Roosevelt and of Sarah's live feed. She thought, briefly and without melodrama,
of what it would mean to ensure that a single incident changed a bank's habits rather than its headlines. By the time the city woke, Heritage had posted a brief notice, an acknowledgement of an incident, a promise of review, an announcement that the CEO was personally overseeing next steps. The copy was careful, written in the neutral tone of corporate communications, but it carried a weight that could be measured in the responses it generated. Some commenters demanded firings, others demanded restorative measures, still others asked for evidence. Bradley's employment status sat in the middle of a calculus that the executives had not yet finalized. He remained on administrative leave pending investigation. The bank's early personnel moves were both a protective measure and a signal, small actions that would be referenced in the coming days as markers of seriousness. The legal team's arrival hours after the incident had transformed a local indignity into a corporate imperative. Their task was not to erase the moment, but to convert it into a sequence of actions that could be validated and measured. They would map personnel consequences, procedural fixes, training plans, and, if necessary, public remedies. They would also prepare for the possibility that regulators might ask questions. That possibility, however uncertain, drove much of their caution. As the first day after the incident folded into its second, the bank's leaders prepared to convene the board. The materials were preliminary but substantial: video evidence, witness statements, internal reports, the draft of a public timeline, and proposals for immediate reforms. An equity app pilot, mandatory bias training, a third-party audit, and a plan to public quarterly progress reports. These were not the dramatic scaffolds of a PR campaign. They were, if enacted, the scaffolds of institutional change. And yet, the scene had not been closed. The lenses that had watched the lobby were still pointed. Sarah's account had been inundated with messages asking for follow-ups. Mrs. Roosevelt circulated the clip among a neighborhood group to highlight the human cost of presumption. Community leaders called for a town hall meeting. The bank's next moves would be watched on multiple screens. In the conference room that evening, the legal team paused to take stock. They had moved quickly, arrived physically, secured evidence, and begun preliminary assessments. But they knew that speed alone was not the remedy. What mattered next would be the combination of transparency, measurable action, and an openness to external oversight. Amara sat at the head of the table and looked at the faces around her. There was fatigue, a legal-minded work, and the raw discomfort of institutional failure. She could sense how the boardroom would shape itself in the hours to come, not as a place to defend the bank, but as a place to hold it to a higher standard. Outside the bank doors, the city continued. People commuted, bars opened, children walked to school. But something had shifted in how those streets would talk about banks and belonging. The clip that began as a 5-minute exchange had become an ethical test for an institution that claimed to serve a community. The question no longer was whether an individual had been wronged. That was evident. The question now was whether a financial institution would choose the hard work of reform or the seductive ease of minimization. At 9:12 p.m., Ellen sent an encrypted message to board members. Please join us at 10 a.m. We will present the timeline, evidence, and a proposed 3-phase plan for immediate action, accountability, and monitoring. The note was sober and without flourish. It was the kind of message that required both attendance and attention. When Amara left the bank that night, she carried with her the quiet knowledge that her presence, the simple fact of entering her place of work, had illuminated a fault line. Her goal was not punishment, but repair. She believed in the possibility that documented injustice, coupled with deliberate leadership, could force institutional change. The hours ahead would test whether Heritage was ready to be transformed or merely to apologize. The legal team would arrive hours later and begin to map out how the bank would answer not only the cameras but the communities they represented. The lobby incident had been captured in pixels and paper. Now, the real work, the design of remedies that could be measured and sustained, was about to begin. The room in which they would do that work hummed with the hushed electricity of those who understand that attention is a resource and that it must be spent wisely. Outside, the city scrolled through social feeds. Comments, shares, and demands accumulated like small petitions. Some viewers tweeted about institutional accountability. Others pointed to the irony of a CEO being asked to leave her own bank. The clip had become more than a moment. It was a prompt, a civic test, an invitation to the bank and other institutions to show whether they would act in ways that matched their public promises. Inside the conference room, with footage queued and witness statements stacked, the team sighed collectively and leaned into the work. They would need to answer questions about training, about escalation, about whether the institution's policies had allowed a frontline staffer to make an exclusionary decision without the tempering influence of judgment. They would ask whether their public commitments had been substantive or symbolic. They began to outline a three-phase response: immediate personnel actions and transparent timelines, mid-term operational reforms, including bias audits and an equity app pilot to track customer experiences, and long-term community investments to rebuild trust. Each phase would require measurable metrics: completion rates for training, independent audit findings, and published updates. But that work, important as it was, lay ahead of them. For now, the legal team had arrived. The live video still circulated. Sarah's followers awaited updates. Mrs. Roosevelt expected an apology that felt real. The bank's leaders had to decide. Would they accept the humility of public accountability or seek to smother the flame that had revealed them? The night settled over the city and the lobby lights went dim. Inside, the legal team continued to stitch together the raw materials of a scandal into a blueprint for change. Outside, the public held its breath, not for spectacle, but for evidence that a single shocking lapse could become the seed of real institutional reform. The boardroom doors opened at 9:58 a.m., 2 minutes before Ellen's summons. Outside in the marble-lit lobby, the week felt both ordinary and irrevocably altered. People went about daily tasks, but the branch itself wore a new kind of attention. It was the place where a simple assumption had been made public. Inside the conference room, the executive team prepared as if assembling evidence for a trial of the institution's conscience. At 10 a.m., the board convened. The senior table was a ring of sober faces, members who had spent careers measuring risk, returning capital, and guarding reputations. A camera feed was projected onto the far wall, the lobby footage cued to play alongside Sarah's live clip. For the board, the clips were not sensational images to be gawked at. They were data points that would decide the bank's path forward. Amara sat at the head of the table, with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades building both strategy and restraint. She did not speak first. The team had asked her to let them present the facts unfiltered. Her role, she had said in the early hours, was to hold the bank accountable to what it pledged to be. Ellen began by laying out the timeline in precise increments, timestamps that had become the scaffolding of truth. 2:47 p.m., entry. 2:50 p.m., teller request for ID. 2:52 p.m., Sarah's live begins. 3:14 p.m., Robert Hayes's confirmation. 7:03 p.m., executive arrival. Each moment carried its own weight, but it was the way they interlocked that compelled action. An ordinary question escalated into security involvement. A live stream magnified an everyday presumption into a civic test. Maria walked the room through legal exposure with a deliberate, almost clinical steadiness. She used the language of risk rather than accusation. "This is not a clean regulatory binary," she said. "The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, ECOA, and the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, are guardrails. We cannot say they will necessarily trigger enforcement actions, but we must plan as if inquiries are possible." Her phrasing kept the focus on the bank's obligations to regulators and to the public, on the steps the institution could credibly take to limit harm and to create evidence of remediation. James, standing at a whiteboard, translated legal vulnerability into operational fixes. He listed the failure points: Frontline verification protocols that did not require immediate escalation to a supervisor when contradictions appeared. An escalation matrix that assumed the person at the front desk would have the authority to resolve ambiguous identity claims. The absence of a bias audit trigger that could prompt urgent remedial action when interactions escalated disproportionately. He circled each item and underlined systemic, making clear this wasn't an isolated personnel problem but a product of a system's blind spots. The footage played, muted at first for the room's decorum, but the images themselves were enough. A small space full of measured steps, a badge placed, a tablet opened, a request to step outside. No melodrama, no theatrics, only the banal choreography that had become a test. The board watched in silence. After the video, Ellen offered the accounts, what had been done to preserve evidence, what the legal team advised as necessary pauses, and the inevitable options the bank would soon face. The room's choices had been framed earlier that night as 3 paths: minimize, partially reform, or transform. Minimizing meant acknowledging an error, disciplining staff in private, and returning to standard business. A partial reform would include some personnel action and a supplementary training program, but leave core processes intact. Transforming would require a systemic response, immediate personnel accountability where warranted, transparent public timelines, external audits, a technological pilot, an equity app to surface and track customer experiences, and community investments bound to measurable outcomes. The conversation was neither theatrical nor rushed. Board members interrogated the plans not to find fault with the team's zeal, but to test the proposal's durability. One member, a longtime director who had previously pushed for conservative governance, asked practical questions. How quickly could the bank implement an independent audit? Who would be the external party? How would the equity app be designed to avoid tokenism? How would the bank measure success beyond press releases? Amara answered the operational questions with the same care she had shown in the lobby. She rejected rhetoric and leaned into specifics. We need an auditor with a clear mandate and public reporting obligations. The equity app must be more than a survey. It has to be a mechanism tied to escalation, to regulatory reporting, and to leadership dashboards. And if we ask for trust again, we must publish the data that proves we earned it. The room registered the phrase, "publish the data," like a new requirement, one that would convert promises into verifiable behavior. The moment of personnel decisions arrived with its own tension. Bradley Mitchell's role was not a philosophical question, but a personnel one. The assistant manager had followed his training to the letter, and that training had been inadequate. The board weighed whether administrative leave, termination, or a conditional rehabilitation path best signaled the bank's commitment to change. After deliberations that threaded legal prudence with moral urgency, the board voted. The decision favored transformation and accountability. Bradley was terminated for failure to exercise judgment consistent with the bank's principles. At the same time, the bank offered him a funded path for remediation, enrollment in an intensive bias education and customer engagement program, supervised by an independent provider with the possibility of future community-facing employment contingent on successful completion and demonstrable growth. The choice balanced personnel consequences with a degree of grace, punitive where judgment had failed, remedial where behavior might be reformed. The board's next moves moved at a deliberate, public pace. Ellen led the team in drafting a statement that would be released later that morning. It was explicit in its language, acknowledgement of the incident, a recognition that the bank had not lived up to its commitments, a promise of transparent review, and concrete first steps. An immediate personnel action, a launch of an independent audit to be completed within a specified window, an equity app pilot, mandatory bias training, and quarterly public reports of progress. The statement positioned Amara at the center of the response. She would personally oversee the equity task force that would implement and monitor these measures. At 11:37 a.m., Heritage posted the statement. The bank's public channels buzzed almost instantaneously. Social media metrics ticked upward. Sarah's original clip circulated anew with headlines that echoed the central fact: Black CEO gets kicked out of her own bank. Legal team arrives hours later. That phrase, a condensation of the week's raw drama, appeared in both local feeds and national headlines. The bank's statement was dissected across platforms. Some praised the transparency, others demanded restitution. The narrative had shifted. The incident was not only about a single sliver of wrongdoing, but about whether a large institution would commit to change. Within hours of the public release, the bank's inbox was filled with requests, interviews, offers to partner on the Equity app, invitations to town halls. Community leaders asked for face-to-face meetings. Mrs. Roosevelt, who had been a witness in the lobby, called a neighborhood meeting that evening and asked the bank to attend.
"If they want our trust back," she said at the meeting, "they'll have to earn it more than a sentence on a website." Ellen, Maria, and James mapped an action plan that accepted public scrutiny as a necessary friction. The independent audit would be contracted to a respected third-party firm that would publish a methodology and a timeline. The Equity app would be developed with input from community representatives and legal oversights to preserve privacy and to ensure evidence could be authenticated if regulators asked. Mandatory bias training would be mandatory for all customer-facing staff, from tellers to security, with completion metrics reported publicly on a quarterly basis. 2 weeks into the plan, early signs of institutional movement appeared. The Equity app pilot was announced with an open call for participants from community organizations. Within its first month, the app recorded hundreds of customer-reported interactions, each tagged, timestamped, and routed to an escalation ladder that included direct leadership review. The independent auditor completed a preliminary scope and outlined a multi-phase review of frontline processes, hiring practices, and customer-facing policies. Bradley's path became a focal point for discussions about individual responsibility and systemic failure. He accepted the bank's offer of remediation and, under the independent program, underwent several weeks of instruction, reflection, and supervised customer interactions with a mentor. The program emphasized not only awareness, but the application of alternative behaviors: how to recognize bias, how to escalate with humility, how to integrate judgment into procedure. The bank, mindful of optics and legal prudence, clarified that reemployment was not guaranteed, but that rehabilitation and demonstrable change would be considered in future hiring for roles that served the community directly. Bradley's story became a complex part of the public narrative, an example of a frontline employee who made a mistake, faced consequences, and entered a remedial pathway funded by the institution he had served. Sarah's live clip continued to exert influence beyond its initial virality. In the weeks after the incident, local media began to reach out to her. A community station invited her to produce a short series on local civic accountability, and a regional paper commissioned her to write an op-ed about citizen documentation. Rather than become simply a bystander, Sarah leaned into a nascent role as a civic chronicler. She partnered with neighborhood organizations to create a protocol for documenting public interactions that included timestamps, witness information, and data privacy guidance, tools to help others turn moments into evidence. Mrs. Roosevelt's role shifted too. The board invited her to be part of the community advisory panel that would help shape the Equity app and the training curriculum. She accepted, less for the spotlight and more to ensure that the bank heard the community's voice at meetings where decisions would be made. Her appointment was symbolic and substantive. The bank had asked for external perspectives, and she agreed to give them. The independent audit's initial findings, released with careful legal oversight, confirmed what the lobby footage had suggested. Policies existed, but implementation was uneven. Escalation matrices were poorly articulated, and frontline training did not sufficiently account for the role of unconscious bias. The review stopped short of apportioning a single cause to the incident, instead framing it as the predictable outcome of policy gaps and cultural blind spots. The auditor recommended a series of changes that mirrored the bank's early commitments. Redesign frontline verification protocols to include real-time executive verification pathways,
integrate bias triggers into escalation matrices, require periodic, externally certified training for all customer-facing staff, and publish quarterly progress reports with anonymized data to preserve privacy while ensuring accountability. Throughout this phase, Amara kept the work centered on process and measurement rather than moral triumph. She asked for dashboards that would show raw inputs, training completion rates, app report volumes, audit findings, side by side with customer satisfaction metrics and community investment decisions. If the public is going to trust us again, she told the team, trust must be trackable. We will publish our progress because if we hide it, we will never have to fix it. 3 months after the lobby incident, the bank released its first quarterly transparency report. It did not contain grand claims. It contained data. The report showed training completion rates, the number of incidents logged through the Equity app, the status of personnel reviews, and the auditor's ongoing recommendations with the bank's responses. Community organizations were invited to comment on the report and to propose additional oversight mechanisms. The report itself became part of how the bank's progress would be evaluated, not privately, but in public view. The release changed the tenor of conversations. Some credit unions and regional banks reached out to Heritage for advice, not to criticize, but to learn. The incident had become a case study for institutional response, rapid evidence preservation, transparent acknowledgement, measurable commitments, and external oversight. Headlines shifted from outrage to cautious curiosity. Could a bank convert a moment of exclusion into a program of inclusion? Not everyone agreed on every step. Critics argued that the board's moves were performative or that personnel changes were insufficiently punitive. Activists demanded deeper resource commitments. Regulators, at a measured distance, noted the bank's transparency while reserving judgment pending further audits.
Amara understood those critiques. She had anticipated them. Transformation, she believed, required both a willingness to face skepticism and the humility to be judged by actions rather than announcements. As the months unfolded, tangible changes seeped into the bank's daily operations. The Equity app went beyond reporting. It created an operational loop that led to managerial reviews within prescribed timelines. Branches with higher incident rates received targeted interventions. Customer satisfaction surveys, retooled to capture qualitatively different data, began to register shifts in perception in neighborhoods that had previously reported feeling underserved. The bank channeled parts of its community investment budget into locally designed programs aimed at financial literacy and home buying support. These moves were not framed as reparations, but as structural commitments to the bank's public mission. Bradley completed the remediation program and participated in a public reconciliation session overseen by the independent provider and attended by community members and staff. He spoke candidly about his actions, his training, and the work ahead. The session was not a redemptive movie moment. It was an uncomfortable public accounting. Whether Bradley would be rehired into a bank role was left open, but the bank indicated that community-facing positions, where sensitivity and judgment were paramount, might be considered only after demonstrable time and independent evaluation. Sarah's work matured into a platform that trained community members in ethical documentation and evidence preservation. She partnered with local nonprofits to create workshops that taught how to collect timestamps, capture witness contact info, and protect privacy. Her platform became a resource rather than a mere spectacle, channeling attention into civic empowerment. Mrs. Roosevelt chaired a community oversight meeting that attracted city council members and civic leaders. The room pulsed with the kind of scrutiny that moves beyond headlines. How to ensure sustained oversight, how to hold corporate promises to account, and how to make public data digestible for residents. Her presence anchored the meetings in a lived experience no policy could replace. Internally, Heritage began to change the cadence of leadership work. Weekly dashboards became public-facing summaries. The bank's executive committee added a permanent line item for equity measures in its quarterly reviews. Recruitment initiatives targeted diverse candidate pools for frontline and managerial roles.
The compliance director reworked training to include scenario-based simulations that forced staff to practice judgment under ambiguous circumstances. The head of security rewrote the protocol to avoid reflexive stand-down orders that could escalate rather than diffuse. The ripple effects reached other institutions. Several community banks reached out to Heritage asking for cooperative work on bias audits.
Academic institutions used the case as a teaching module for ethics and organizational behavior courses. A trade association convened a panel to discuss best practices for verification policies that reduce discriminatory outcomes. The incident proved, in slow increments, to be an impetus for sector-wide conversation about the intersection of security protocols and social assumptions. None of this erased what had happened in the lobby, the humiliation, the public questioning, the embodied exclusion that signaled deeper cultural forces. But it did ask institutions to build systems that would make such moments less likely. The work relied on documentation, CCTV, timestamps, citizen witnesses, but also on moral imagination, the willingness of leaders to convert scrutiny into sustained work. 1 year after the lobby incident, Heritage held a public forum to review progress. The room was full. Community leaders, board members, regulators, staff, and residents who had been following the bank's quarterly reports. Amara opened the session with an acknowledgement of the incident's human cost and a catalog of what had changed since then. She read the progress numbers, not in triumph but in accountability. Training completion rates, audit milestones, the equity app's logged incidents and their average resolution time, and the community investments made with partners. The independent auditor presented a second report that showed progress on the majority of recommendations and outlined remaining work. The board announced that an ongoing oversight council, comprised of community members and external experts, would remain active for at least 3 years, with public minutes and public dashboards. Mrs. Roosevelt was on that council. Sarah moderated a panel about civic documentation. Bradley was not at the podium. His future employment was still subject to the outcomes of the remediation program, but he had appeared in several staff training sessions to share what he had learned. If there was a public symbol of the bank's change, it was not an award or an ad campaign. It was a small plaque in the flagship lobby thanking community members for their participation in the Oversight Council, paired with a touchscreen kiosk that allowed visitors to submit feedback directly to the Equity Task Force. The kiosk was not ornamental. It was connected to the app and to real managerial accountability. People used it. Industry observers noted that Heritage had taken a path that was risk-laden. Public transparency exposes institutions to criticism, but also potentially stabilizing. By owning the work and publishing its progress, the bank created a framework in which trust could be rebuilt through verifiable action. Regulators continued to watch, and the bank prepared for potential inquiries, having preserved evidence and documented process milestones from day one.
The distinction between being accused and being accountable had become, in the bank's practice, a difference in documentation. For Amara, the work remained less about accolades and more about the daily rigor of leadership. She received both praise and critique. Some lauded the bank's transparency. Others argued more radical steps were necessary. She welcomed the tension. "If our work feels unfinished," she told a reporter months later, "that means we are still accountable, not that we have failed. Accountability is an ongoing posture, not a momentary act." The scene in the lobby became a teaching tool in training rooms across the bank. The footage was used in scenario discussions, the Equity app's reports were turned into case studies, and the independent audit's recommendations were integrated into leadership reviews. The bank did not pretend the past was fully corrected. It used the past as a lever to change the future. Outside institutions paid attention. A consortium of regional financial institutions issued a white paper recommending that frontline verification protocols include real-time executive verification channels and community-approved oversight mechanisms, the very changes Heritage had implemented. Trade journals chronicled the bank's approach as an example of converting reputational crisis into structural reform. The headline that had once read, "Black CEO gets kicked out of her own bank, legal team arrives hours later," mutated into longer headlines about institutional accountability and transformative response. The juxtaposition was stark. The same incident that had been a symbol of exclusion had become a catalyst for conversations about belonging in financial institutions. In the community, small signs of change accumulated. A neighborhood leader reported improved responsiveness at their local branch. A youth financial literacy program funded through the bank's redirected resources taught dozens of students practical money skills. The Equity app recorded fewer high-severity incidents in several branches that had undergone intensive coaching. None of these changes erased the harm that had been done, but they did indicate a pattern. Documented injustice plus deliberate leadership could tilt behavior. Months later, when asked whether the public attention had been an unwelcome intrusion into a day's work, Amara replied with a reflection that captured the moral center of the story. "Being asked to leave your own workplace is a wound," she said. "What we chose to do after that wound was what mattered. We had the opportunity to be defensive or to be honest. We chose honesty, and honesty is messy, but it is the only bridge to trust." Bradley's story continued to generate mixed reactions. Some community members felt his termination was too lenient. Others argued that a path to rehabilitation, when paired with robust accountability, demonstrated humane leadership.
The bank kept the remediation program in place for other staff who faced similar training deficits, and the program itself was refined based on independent oversight. Sarah's journalistic endeavors grew into a modest but dedicated civic beat. Rather than chasing virality, she worked to equip neighbors with the tools to document public life responsibly. Her platform encouraged evidence-based engagement and fostered partnerships with local watchdog groups. She remained, as she had been in the flag-lit lobby, a witness who turned attention into civic action. Mrs. Roosevelt became, for a time, the public face of the Community Oversight Council. She did not want the attention. She wanted the bank to do the work. Her presence at meetings made it harder for the institution to slip back into complacency. She would remind executives of the lived reality behind the policies. "When people come here," she would say, "they shouldn't feel like strangers in their own town." The years that followed saw push and pull between progress and relapse. No institution ever moves in a straight, perfect line when changing culture. Audits found areas that required more work. New staff brought fresh dynamics that demanded constant training. But the bank's default changed. Transparency and measurement became routine, not extraordinary. At an industry conference 2 years later, an African-American woman in the audience raised a hand and said, "Heritage's response was slow at first, but it shows that institutions can change if leaders choose to be accountable." A panelist from another bank nodded and added, "You can call it reputational risk management, or you can call it moral obligation. Either way, the data now exists to show what works." And that was perhaps the most consequential shift, the move from anecdote to evidence. What had begun as a civilian's Instagram live clip and a 5-minute lobby exchange had become a body of work with timelines, audits, measurable interventions, and published results. The case did not erase discrimination. It created mechanisms to surface and address it. In the end, the headline that had stung the most, the one that bluntly captured the scene's injustice, was not erased from public memory. Instead, it became a frame for a longer narrative. A black CEO was told to leave her own bank. The legal team arrived hours later. The board chose to act. The institution committed to measurable reform. The drama that had once been about exclusion was reoriented toward the harder work of repair. Amara rarely framed the story in personal terms. She would say, when pressed, that the moment had been both painful and clarifying. The question was not whether we could apologize, she told the Oversight Council at a meeting, but whether we could build systems to keep apologies from being necessary in the first place. That orientation toward systems and to the ongoing work of measurement became the bank's operating ethic going forward.
The moral of the episode was not tidy. It did not promise that every institution would act in the same way, or that every harmed person would receive perfect remedy. Instead, it offered a practical pattern. Documentation matters, witnesses matter, leadership choices matter, and when an institution is willing to convert scrutiny into structural change, the possibility of repair, however partial, becomes real. On a calm afternoon, nearly 2 years after the lobby incident, a new plaque was unveiled in the flagship branch. It acknowledged the bank's misstep, listed the commitments the bank had made, and provided a QR code linking to the most recent transparency reports and to the Equity app. Mrs. Roosevelt spoke briefly at the unveiling. "We do not want to be trophies on a wall," she said. "We want to be partners in holding our institutions to their best promises." The applause that followed was modest and purposeful. There were no final bows, no cinematic resolutions. The bank's work continued: quarterly reports, oversight meetings, training updates, community investments. The story's generator, the moment when a CEO was told to leave her own bank, remained a touchstone. It was the point from which reform had been negotiated. As public attention gradually normalized, the lesson persisted. Moments of injustice, when captured with care and met with deliberate leadership, can catalyze institutional change. The arc from humiliation to accountability required documentation, witnesses, legal prudence, and the courageous decision to choose transformation over minimization. If a single truth stitched this story together, it was that institutions are collections of policies and people. Change requires fixing both. The video on Sarah's page remained available, a raw reminder of how quickly assumptions become public tests. The Equity app, the audit reports, and the Oversight Council transformed that rawness into a framework for ongoing accountability. And in the quiet between reports and town halls, people continue to live their lives: banking, teaching, parenting, running small businesses. Measuring the bank not by its apologies, but by its actions. That was the slow work of rebuilding trust, and it was the kind of labor that required more than headlines. It required steady, measurable change. If you've seen moments like this in your community, moments where assumptions were made public and accountability was demanded, share them in the comments. Tell us how institutions responded where you are. Subscribe for more stories that trace how documented injustice and deliberate leadership can shape change. Share this video with someone who needs to see that attention and action together can alter an institution's path.